Above all of this, a new paradigm of naval air defense had established itself as operational reality. This was not the relatively straightforward aerial combat of earlier campaigns, where fighters met fighters in the classic engagement of dogfighting and maneuvering. Instead, what had evolved was a complex geometry of interception, a three-dimensional chess game played at speeds measured in hundreds of miles per hour, where timing and positioning meant the difference between successful defense and catastrophic penetration of the fleet's protective screen. Fighter pilots, drawn from both Navy and Marine Corps squadrons, had become something quite specific in this new form of warfare. They were kamikaze hunters, a designation that captured both the nature of their quarry and the grim determination required to pursue aircraft whose pilots had already accepted death as the certain outcome of their mission. These American aviators would streak outward from the carriers in their Grumman Hellcats and Chance Vought Corsairs, their radios crackling with vectors and bearings provided by fighter direction officers who watched the developing picture on radar screens and worked to position the interceptors where they could do the most good. At the same time, the ships of the fleet itself had become participants in this aerial battle in ways that went far beyond the anti-aircraft defences of previous years. The decks and superstructures of cruisers, battleships, and destroyers bristled with guns of every calibre. The smaller weapons, the 20mm Oerlikon cannons and 40mm Bofors guns, were there for close-in defence, the last-ditch effort to knock down an attacker already committed to its final dive. But the real reach of the fleet's defensive firepower came from the 5-inch dual-purpose guns, weapons that could be elevated to engage aircraft or depressed to fire against surface targets. These guns, directed by radar systems and fire control computers that represented some of the most sophisticated technology available to the Navy, could throw their shells miles into the sky, creating what amounted to walls of exploding steel through which incoming aircraft had to fly. Within those 5-inch shells, many of them anyway, resided something that represented a fundamental change in the nature of anti-aircraft warfare. The proximity fuse, sometimes called the VT fuse in official documentation, was a device that embodied both technological sophistication and operational secrecy to a degree unusual even in a war filled with classified developments. This fuse would not detonate its shell at a predetermined time, calculated and set before firing based on estimates of where the target might be. Nor would it require the direct impact of shell against aircraft, a happenstance of geometry and chance that occurred far less often than gunners would have liked. Instead, this fuse would explode its shell when it sensed that an aircraft had come close enough that the detonation would have lethal effect, turning near misses into killing bursts. The pilots who flew combat air patrol over the fleet, those hunters racing to intercept the incoming raids, had gradually learned to place a certain degree of trust in the gunners manning the fleet's anti-aircraft batteries. This trust was born of necessity and experience. The fighter pilots knew that they could not be everywhere at once, that no matter how aggressive their interceptions, some enemy aircraft would slip through to press attacks against the ships. In those moments, the volume and accuracy of the fleet's anti-aircraft fire became the critical factor. But these same pilots were also learning, sometimes through experiences that left them shaken and angry, to fear the unseen reach of these new fuses. The proximity-fused shells did not announce their presence until they detonated, and they could explode in flight paths that pilots thought were safely separated from the engagement zones where the gunners were firing at enemy aircraft. The trust and the fear existed simultaneously, an uncomfortable duality that would force changes in doctrine and procedure. The development of the proximity fuse had been driven by urgent necessity, born from the recognition that conventional anti-aircraft fire, for all the mathematical sophistication of the fire control systems directing it, remained fundamentally inadequate against fast-moving aerial targets. The traditional approach to anti-aircraft gunnery relied on what was essentially educated guesswork, though that guesswork had been refined through layers of mathematics and mechanical computation. Fire control computers would receive inputs about the target's observed position, course, and speed. They would calculate a predicted future position, accounting for the time it would take the shell to reach that point in space. A mechanical time fuse would be set accordingly, intended to detonate the shell when it reached the predicted location. The problem was that aircraft did not fly in perfectly predictable paths, and even small variations in speed or direction meant that the shell might arrive at the designated point in space a fraction of a second early or late. In such cases, the aircraft would simply fly past the burst, unharmed, and the shell's lethal energy would be wasted in empty air. The proximity fuse transformed this calculus entirely. The engineering that made it possible was remarkable, particularly given the constraints under which it had to operate. Inside the body of the fuse, which had to be compact enough to fit in the nose of a 5-inch shell and robust enough to survive being fired from a gun, designers had managed to fit a collection of miniature vacuum tubes, a radio transmitter, a radio receiver, and the necessary circuitry to process the signals and trigger the detonator. As the shell travelled through the air after being fired, this tiny radio transmitter would emit a signal. The receiver would listen for reflections of that signal bouncing back from nearby objects. When something large and metallic, like an aircraft's fuselage, wing surface, or spinning propeller, came close enough to the shell, the character of the returned signal would change in specific ways that the circuitry had been designed to recognize. At that moment, the circuit would fire the detonator, and the shell's main explosive charge would detonate, sending a dense pattern of metal fragments expanding outward from the point of burst. This meant that proximity became the relevant variable rather than time or impact. A shell that passed 20 or 30 feet from an aircraft, a miss by any conventional standard, could now become a lethal burst that would shred control surfaces, puncture fuel tanks, damage engines, or kill or wound the crew. The official designation of the device as VT Fuse was itself a piece of operational security. The letters stood for variable time, a designation chosen deliberately to obscure the true nature of the fuse in the abbreviated language of military communications and paperwork. If an enemy intercepted a message referring to VT ammunition, they might reasonably assume it was simply an improved time fuse with some kind of variable setting mechanism. The true function, the fact that these shells carried miniature radar sets that would detonate on proximity to a target, remained hidden behind this innocent-sounding designation. The United States Navy had been the first service to deploy the proximity fuse in combat, and the decision about where and when to use it had been made with careful consideration of the risks involved. The great fear was that the enemy might recover an intact or partially intact fuse from a dud shell, subject it to technical analysis, and discover the principles behind its operation. If that happened, the Japanese or Germans might develop their own versions, or they might develop countermeasures that would reduce its effectiveness. The Navy's reasoning was that shells fired over the ocean far from land offered the best security. If a shell failed to detonate, it would fall into the sea and sink to depths that would make recovery essentially impossible. Even if a shell detonated near an aircraft and fragments struck the water nearby, the ocean would swallow the evidence without giving the enemy any opportunity for examination. Beginning in early 1943, in the waters around the Solomon Islands, where American and Japanese naval forces were engaged in a grinding campaign of attrition, United States warships began employing proximity-fused ammunition against Japanese aircraft. The first uses were careful and controlled, with strict accounting of every round fired and careful attention to the results. Performance reports began to filter up through the chain of command, written in the carefully neutral language that military organizations use to describe new weapons and tactics. Officers analyzing these reports could see clearly that something significant had changed. The proportion of aircraft that were being damaged or destroyed by 5-inch airbursts had climbed sharply compared to the results achieved with conventional time-fused ammunition. This was not simply a matter of more shells happening to detonate near their targets, though that was certainly part of the story. The proximity fuse was changing the fundamental geometry of the engagement, expanding the lethal radius around each shell and making the sky a more dangerous place for aircraft trying to attack the fleet. As the war in the Pacific continued through 1943 and into 1944, the Japanese Imperial Navy and Army Air Forces found themselves increasingly on the defensive, their trained pilot pools depleted by the attrition of combat and their ability to replace aircraft hampered by American submarine attacks on shipping and the growing distance between their manufacturing centers and the combat zones. In this context, Japan's military leadership turned increasingly to special attack tactics, what the Japanese called TOCO, or special attack units, and what American forces would come to know by the term kamikaze, meaning divine wind. The organized use of these suicide aircraft began during the Leyte campaign in October 1944, when the Imperial Navy sent bombers and fighters loaded with explosives and piloted by volunteers who had accepted that they would not return from their missions. These aircraft would attempt to crash directly into American ships, turning the aircraft and pilot into a guided bomb. Through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945, these special attack tactics intensified. The Japanese had recognized that a pilot of limited training could still be taught to take off, navigate to a target area, and dive into a ship. This required far less instruction than training someone to the level of proficiency needed for conventional combat operations, where dogfighting, formation flying, navigation, and weapons employment all required extensive practice. The suicide attacks also represented a way to maximize the impact of a limited number of aircraft and pilots. In theory, every kamikaze sortie should result in damage or destruction of an enemy ship, a much better exchange ratio than could be achieved through conventional bombing or torpedo attacks, where most aircraft might be shot down or miss their targets without achieving any result. By the time the American invasion of Okinawa began in April 1945, the Japanese had refined their mass attack tactics and prepared to employ them on an unprecedented scale. Okinawa was close enough to the Japanese home islands to be within range of aircraft based in Kyushu and Formosa, and the Japanese commanders recognized that the American fleet gathered around Okinawa represented both a terrible threat and a critical target. If they could inflict sufficient damage on the invasion fleet, they might force the Americans to withdraw, or at least buy time to prepare defenses of the home islands themselves. The result was a series of mass raids designated by the Japanese as kikusui attacks, meaning floating chrysanthemum, a reference to the imperial symbol. These attacks would hurl hundreds of aircraft toward the American ships, a combination of dedicated suicide planes and escort fighters, all converging on the fleet in waves that would test the limits of what the American defenses could handle. The American response to this threat had evolved into a layered defense system that integrated multiple elements into a coordinated whole. At the outermost layer were the radar picket ships, those destroyers and smaller vessels positioned far from the main body of the fleet. Their radars could detect incoming raids at ranges measured in dozens of miles, providing early warning that allowed the fleet to prepare its defenses and scramble additional fighters. Fighter direction officers, working in the combat information centers aboard these picket ships and in similar facilities aboard the carriers, would analyze the radar returns and use radio communications to vector the combat air patrols toward the incoming formations. These fighter directors became critical nodes in the defense system, their ability to read the radar picture and position the fighters effectively often making the difference between a successful interception and a penetration that would reach the ships. The fighters themselves, typically operating in divisions of 4 aircraft or sections of 2, would race outward toward the contacts, climbing for altitude and speed as they went. The pilots had learned through bitter experience that engaging the kamikazes as far from the fleet as possible was essential. Every aircraft shot down 50 or 75 miles out was one that would not have the opportunity to dive on a ship. These interceptions could be chaotic, with formations of Japanese aircraft that might include purpose-built kamikaze planes, escort fighters, and conventional bombers all mixed together. The American pilots had to make split-second decisions about which targets to engage, all while managing their fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure and trying to maintain situational awareness in a sky that might contain dozens of aircraft, all maneuvering at high speed. For those enemy aircraft that got past the fighter screen, the next layer of defense consisted of the fleet's gun batteries. Every ship capable of doing so would be firing, creating a volume of anti-aircraft fire that veterans would describe in terms that sounded almost poetic despite the brutal reality they described. The 40mm and 20mm guns, manually aimed or directed by simple computing sights, would fill the air with tracers that arced up toward diving aircraft. These weapons were effective only at relatively short ranges, perhaps a mile or less for the 40mm and even closer for the 20mm. But at those ranges, their volume of fire could be devastating. The 5-inch batteries, however, gave the fleet a much longer reach. Directed by radar and fire control computers that could track targets and compute firing solutions, these guns could engage aircraft at ranges where the smaller caliber weapons were useless. In this defensive system, proximity-fused 5-inch ammunition became what might be described as the long arm of the fleet's protection. A properly directed 5-inch gun could throw a pattern of proximity-fused shells into the projected path of an incoming aircraft at ranges of several miles. When the system worked as it had been designed to work, the effects could be dramatic. Kamikaze aircraft, often flying low over the water in an attempt to evade radar detection and to reduce the effectiveness of the heavy anti-aircraft guns, whose shells had to be fired in higher arcs to reach high-altitude targets, would suddenly find themselves flying through patterns of airbursts. These bursts would appear with startling suddenness, black-grey smudges of smoke marking where shells had detonated, each burst throwing out a cone of metal fragments travelling at velocities measured in thousands of feet per second. The fragments from these proximity-fused bursts would hammer into wings and fuselages, puncturing fuel tanks and oil lines, damaging control surfaces, severing hydraulic lines, and sometimes killing or wounding the pilots. Many aircraft, struck by this invisible hail of metal, would waver in their flight, their pilots struggling to maintain control as engines lost power or control surfaces failed to respond. Some would simply fall from the sky, trailing smoke and flame as they spiraled down to crash into the ocean well short of their intended targets. Others would arrive at the outer screen of destroyers and smaller ships already crippled, flying on damaged engines and with wounded pilots, making them easier targets for the 40mm and 20mm guns that would finish them off. For the American fighter pilots, however, this new reality of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire represented a significant change in the calculus of risk that they faced every time they scrambled to intercept a raid. These pilots had been trained according to doctrines that emphasized aggressive pursuit of the enemy. Their instincts and their orders drove them to close with the Japanese formations, to intercept as far out as possible, and to press their attacks until the threats were eliminated. They were, in their own minds and in the minds of those who directed them, hunters. The comparison was apt. They ranged far from their base ships, searched for prey, closed for the kill, and pursued with single-minded determination. But the sky around the fleet had become something qualitatively different from what earlier generations of fighter pilots had known. This was no longer simply a three-dimensional space through which aircraft maneuvered. It had become an instrumented volume, mapped and measured by radar beams that swept through it continuously, divided into sectors and zones that existed on plotting boards and in the minds of fighter directors and gun control officers. Every point in this space had coordinates, bearings and ranges and altitudes that could be measured and predicted. The radar systems feeding information to the fire control computers were not just detecting where aircraft were at any given moment, they were predicting where those aircraft would be seconds into the future, calculating the leads and elevations necessary for the guns to put shells into the path of a target. The 5-inch batteries were no longer simply throwing time-fused bursts into general zones of sky where enemy aircraft might be. The fire control solutions being computed and the proximity fuses screwed into the shells meant that the guns were placing proximity-triggered explosions into precisely those volumes of space through which aircraft were expected to fly. This created an obvious problem. A friendly fighter on a pursuit curve, chasing a Japanese aircraft toward the fleet or maneuvering to intercept one that had broken through the outer screen, might very well have to fly through exactly the same space where the fire control computers were predicting that shells needed to detonate. The after-action reports filed by squadrons returning from the Okinawa campaign began to include a new kind of frustration in the observations recorded by intelligence officers debriefing the pilots. These aviators were accustomed to certain kinds of danger. They understood and accepted the risks of dogfighting, where an enemy pilot might get on their tail, or where a damaged aircraft might not make it back to the carrier. They had learned to deal with Japanese anti-aircraft fire over enemy airfields and installations, which followed familiar patterns even when it was intense and accurate. What they found more difficult to accept was being bracketed by airbursts from their own fleet's guns, explosions that seemed to them disconcertingly precise, and more troubling still, apparently indifferent to the distinction between friend and foe. The technical reality was straightforward, though not necessarily comforting to pilots who found themselves flying through friendly fire. The proximity fuse, for all its sophistication, could not distinguish between the aluminum and steel of an American fighter and the aluminum and steel of a Japanese bomber. The radio signal it transmitted and the reflections it received were based purely on the physics of electromagnetic radiation bouncing off metal surfaces. The circuitry that decided when to fire the detonator had no way to interrogate the identification friend or foe transponder that American aircraft carried. It simply sensed the presence of something large and metallic within its trigger range and initiated detonation. A Grumman Hellcat or Chance Vought Corsair that crossed into an engagement basket, a volume of sky into which shells were being fired at a kamikaze, would present exactly the same kind of return signal to the proximity fuse as the target itself. Even when pilots thought they had maintained a safe offset from the target their gunners were engaging, they could find themselves close enough to airbursts that fragments would pepper their aircraft. The lethal radius of a 5-inch proximity-fused burst was not precisely defined, and fragments could travel considerable distances from the point of detonation, especially the fragments that were thrown forward in the direction of the shell's flight. Pilots reported returning to their carriers with wing surfaces holed by shrapnel, with cracked or shattered canopy panels, with control cables severed or hydraulic lines punctured. Some aircraft were lost outright, either brought down by damage severe enough to cause structural failure or crashes, or forced to ditch when engines failed from fragment damage. These losses and near losses were not always recorded explicitly as friendly fire incidents. In the chaos of a mass raid, where multiple defensive systems were firing simultaneously and where aircraft were maneuvering violently, it could be difficult or impossible to determine with certainty whether damage had come from friendly shells or from return fire by Japanese gunners aboard the attacking aircraft. The Navy, being an organization that learned from experience and adapted its procedures accordingly, began developing responses to this problem. Fighter direction officers, those specialists who sat in the combat information centers and watched the radar displays while talking to the pilots over the radio, started to carve out what might be thought of as exclusion volumes in the airspace above and around the fleet. They would assign specific altitude blocks to the combat air patrols, telling fighters to maintain patrol at 18,000 feet, for example, while directing anti-aircraft fire to avoid bursts above 15,000 feet in certain sectors. They would warn gun batteries to hold their fire with proximity-fused ammunition when friendly fighters were visibly engaged with enemy aircraft in particular areas of the sky. Procedural codes and brevity words evolved to provide quick communications, allowing a fighter director to transmit an immediate check-fire order when an interception was merging with a gun target line on the radar plot. The gunners themselves, men who had trained extensively to respond instantly to orders and to maintain the high rates of fire necessary for effective anti-aircraft defense, had to learn to operate along a much finer line between maintaining defensive fire and avoiding fratricide. This was not a simple matter of discipline or training, though both were certainly involved. It required a kind of split-second judgment that had to account for the positions and movements of multiple aircraft, the flight time of shells already in the air, and the constantly changing geometry of an engagement where both friendly and enemy aircraft might be maneuvering at speeds in excess of 300 miles per hour. Some ships developed procedures that segmented their anti-aircraft fire arcs, creating specific sectors where 5-inch batteries would hold fire or use only mechanical time fuses or contact fuses when friendly fighters were operating in those areas. This allowed the gunners to continue engaging targets in other sectors while preserving safe lanes for the combat air patrol to pursue enemy aircraft. Other ships imposed altitude restrictions on their proximity-fused fire, relying on the older time-fused or impact-fused ammunition when engaging low-altitude targets if friendlies were in the area. This was not an ideal solution, as it surrendered some of the advantage that the proximity fuse provided, but it was judged preferable to the alternative of shooting down friendly aircraft. The tension between the needs of the air defense fighters and the surface-to-air gunners became, in a sense, a measure of just how effective the proximity fuse actually was. The metal fragments that could tear through the aluminum skin and magnesium components of a Japanese aircraft could do exactly the same damage to an American one. The trust that had to exist between pilots and gunners, the understanding that both were working toward the same goal of defending the fleet, had to be maintained despite this new hazard that the proximity fuse had introduced into their shared battle space. Despite these challenges and the friction they created, very few people in positions of authority questioned the overall effectiveness and value of the proximity-fused ammunition. Statistical analyses conducted both during the campaign and in the months following the end of the war provided empirical support for what observers had seen in action. When analysts compared the hit rates and casualty infliction achieved by 5-inch anti-aircraft batteries using proximity fuses against the performance of the same batteries when firing time-fused or contact-fused ammunition, the results showed a multiplicative improvement. The exact figures varied depending on the circumstances and the quality of the fire control solutions being generated, but the general conclusion was that proximity fuses had increased the effectiveness of 5-inch anti-aircraft fire by a factor of several times over what had been achievable with conventional ammunition. This translated directly into survival for ships that might otherwise have been overwhelmed. Destroyers on radar picket duty, vessels that found themselves acting as magnets for every Japanese aircraft that could be thrown at them, now had at least a fighting chance to disrupt and destroy attackers before those aircraft reached their final attack positions. The difference between being forced to rely entirely on last-ditch weapons like the 40mm and 20mm guns, which could only engage aircraft that had already committed to their terminal dives, and having the ability to create lethal airbursts at ranges of several miles, was literally the difference between survival and destruction for many ships. Ships that employed their 5-inch batteries effectively with proximity-fused ammunition could break up attack formations, force aircraft to maneuver defensively at ranges where their pilots were not yet committed to specific targets, and attrit the incoming waves before they closed to the distance where every gun would be firing and where even a damaged aircraft might still manage to crash into a ship. For the Japanese pilots flying these suicide missions, the presence of proximity-fused ammunition represented a lethal development that they were often inadequately prepared to counter. The pilots selected for kamikaze duty were frequently among the least experienced aviators that Japan could put into the air, young men who had received only enough training to take off, navigate to a general target area, and execute a diving attack. Their briefings would include whatever information was available about American defensive measures and tactics, and they would be advised to approach low to the water to minimize radar detection time, to use the sun if possible to make visual acquisition more difficult for fighter pilots and gunners, and to weave and maneuver unpredictably to complicate fire control solutions. But these tactics, such as they were, could not overcome the basic physics of what happened when a 5-inch proximity-fused shell detonated at the optimal range from an aircraft. the shell casing would fragment into thousands of pieces, metal shards of various sizes and shapes, all of them thrown outward from the point of detonation at velocities that made them lethal to aircraft structures and to human tissue. The pattern of these fragments was not spherical, as might be assumed for a static explosion. The shell was travelling at high velocity when it detonated, and this forward motion meant that the fragments were thrown forward and outward in a cone-shaped pattern. The density and velocity of this swarm of metal in the forward arc were particularly devastating. An aircraft flying into such a burst, or having such a burst detonate alongside or slightly ahead of it, would be subjected to what was essentially a hailstorm of supersonic metal. Fragments would punch through the thin aluminum skin of wings and fuselages as if it were paper. Fuel tanks, even self-sealing tanks that could handle single punctures, might be holed in multiple places, leading to catastrophic fuel loss or fires. Oil lines could be severed, leading to rapid loss of lubrication and engine seizure. Control cables could be cut, leaving pilots unable to steer their aircraft. Hydraulic systems could fail, making it impossible to operate landing gear, flaps, or in some cases, control surfaces. The aircraft's engine or engines, critical components that had to continue functioning if the plane was to stay aloft, were vulnerable to fragment strikes that could damage cylinders, crack crankcases, or sever the fuel lines feeding them. Many of the Japanese pilots never reached the point where their determination and acceptance of death could translate into an impact against an American ship. They were simply killed in the air, their aircraft torn apart or sent tumbling out of control by proximity bursts, or they found themselves struggling to control damaged aircraft that were rapidly losing altitude and capabilities. Those who did manage to press through the outer layers of defense often arrived at the inner screen already flying crippled aircraft, making them slower and more predictable targets for the concentrated fire of the 40mm and 20mm batteries that would shred anything that came within their reach. The secrecy surrounding the proximity fuse remained a matter of serious concern throughout its combat employment and even after the war's end. Crews who handled the ammunition were given specific instructions about the importance of preventing capture of the fuses or allowing the enemy to recover specimens. Ships were ordered to ensure that any duds, shells that had been fired but failed to detonate, were either recovered and disposed of properly, or, if they had fallen into the water, were left there, rather than risking an attempt at recovery that might alert the enemy to the presence of something worth investigating. In cases where ships were operating in shallow waters, where a dud might conceivably be recovered by enemy divers, procedures called for either destroying the shell with gunfire or marking its location for later recovery by friendly forces. The pilots, for their part, knew enough to complain and to ask questions about the coordination between fighters and the fleet's guns. They understood that shells were exploding in ways that seemed different from the time-fused anti-aircraft fire they had seen in earlier campaigns. They could observe that bursts seemed to occur with uncanny accuracy near aircraft, even when those aircraft were maneuvering. But they did not necessarily understand the technical details of how the shells were achieving this effect. Some assumed it was simply better radar and fire control. Others speculated about new types of time fuses with shorter settings or about shells that were somehow tracking their targets. The true nature of the proximity fuse, the fact that each shell carried a miniature radar set, remained classified information that was shared only with those who had a clear need to know. In time, as the campaign progressed and as the various after-action reports were compiled and analysed, the lessons learned about coordinating fighters and fleet air defence became institutionalised in doctrine and standard operating procedures. Combat air patrol stations were pushed further outward from the fleet when possible, creating greater separation between the areas where fighters were expected to operate and the zones where heavy anti-aircraft fire would be concentrated. Interception doctrine increasingly emphasised the importance of engaging raids beyond the outer envelope of the fleet's heavy gun coverage, which typically extended to ranges of 10 to 15 miles, depending on the altitude of the targets and the capabilities of the fire control radars. In some raids, the most effective defensive pattern that emerged involved an initial fighter-driven engagement that would cull the attacking formation while it was still at long range from the fleet, eliminating as many aircraft as possible before they could close to where they represented immediate threats. As the surviving attackers penetrated closer and the engagement geometry collapsed inward toward the ships themselves, the fighter directors would execute what amounted to a controlled handoff to the surface-to-air weapons. Fighters would be directed to specific sectors or altitudes that had been cleared for their use, while the 5-inch batteries would concentrate their fire in other sectors where no friendly aircraft were present. This interplay was never perfect, and it would be a mistake to suggest that the coordination ever reached a point where friendly fire incidents were entirely eliminated or where every raid was handled with textbook efficiency. The radar picket ships, positioned far from the main body of the fleet and often operating with only 1 or 2 fighter divisions allocated to their defense, frequently found themselves in situations where they had no choice but to fire, regardless of where friendly fighters might be. The alternative was to hold fire and allow attackers to close unopposed, which would almost certainly result in the destruction of the picket ship itself. The casualty lists from the radar picket destroyer force, with their grim accounting of ships battered, ships sunk, and men killed and wounded, stand as the melancholy ledger of the necessity of accepting some risk of friendly fire in order to prevent certain destruction. By the time the war ended in August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet entry into the war against Japan, the proximity fuse had become widely recognized within the American military as a symbol of the kind of decisive technological advantage that could emerge from focused research and development efforts. The device had proven its worth not only in the Pacific theater, where it had helped blunt the Kamikaze offensive, but also in Europe, where proximity-fused ammunition had been employed against German V-1 flying bombs, shooting down these early cruise missiles with remarkable efficiency, and where proximity-fused artillery shells had been used with devastating effect against German troop concentrations during the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944 to 1945. In the Pacific context specifically, the proximity fuse had helped the United States Navy cope with an unprecedented form of aerial attack, one that exploited the psychological and tactical advantages of pilots willing to die in order to achieve hits against their targets. The ability to disrupt and destroy suicide aircraft before they could complete their attacks had been critical to maintaining the fleet's ability to support the invasion of Okinawa and to keeping the sea lanes open despite the sustained Japanese air offensive. For the men who had flown combat air patrol over the fleet during that campaign, however, the memory of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire carried a particular sharpness that went beyond abstract considerations of technological advantage or tactical effectiveness. These pilots had personal experiences of flying through air bursts that their own fleet had created, watching shock waves that were powerful enough to create visible disturbances in the air, seeing the ripple effects that could wrinkle the metal skin of their aircraft's wings, and hearing the distinctive sound of fragments striking metal. They had landed back on carrier decks and climbed out of their cockpits to find shrapnel embedded in control surfaces, holes punched through wing panels, cracks in canopy plexiglass. Some of the pilots had learned the hard edges of the new defensive doctrine through experiences that left them shaken or injured. Others had not returned at all, their aircraft damaged too severely to continue flying, or their wounds too grave to allow them to bring their planes back to the ship. The exact number of American aircraft and pilots lost to friendly anti-aircraft fire during the Okinawa campaign is difficult to establish with precision, in part because of the chaos of combat record-keeping, and in part because of the difficulty of determining, after the fact, whether damage had been caused by enemy fire or by friendly bursts. But that such losses occurred was beyond question, and the men who survived carried those experiences with them. The lessons that these pilots and their experience forced into the Navy's operational procedures, the altitude separation standards, the sector discipline requirements, the emphasis on positive control and clear communications between fighter directors and gun batteries, all of these would echo forward into the post-war development of air defense concepts. The Navy's thinking about how to organize carrier task force defenses in potential future conflicts how to position combat air patrols, how to coordinate between fighter aircraft and surface-to-air weapons. All of this would be informed by what had been learned over Okinawa. Later, as guided missiles began to replace guns as the primary fleet air defense weapons, and as the speeds and altitudes of jet aircraft created new problems for defensive coordination, the fundamental principles about creating safe lanes for friendly aircraft while still maintaining effective fire against threats would remain relevant. The phrase that the pilots would have used to describe themselves during that campaign was direct and unpretentious. They were hunters. This was not empty bravado or false modesty, but rather an accurate description of their role and their mindset. They had gone up day after day, sometimes multiple times in a single day, to meet aircraft whose pilots were bent on dying in order to kill the men in the ships below. The fighter pilot's task was to find these attackers, close with them, shoot them down, and repeat the process for as long as the raids continued and for as long as fuel and ammunition held out. They operated far from their ships, ranging out to the limits of their combat radius, searching for contacts that might be nothing more than returns on a radar scope until the moment when they achieved visual contact and could confirm that what they were chasing was indeed a formation of hostile aircraft. What these pilots had never expected, at least not when they had first deployed to the theatre and first begun flying combat air patrol, was that some of the most dangerous bursts that would appear in their flight paths might be explosions set off by shells fired by their own side. They had not anticipated that they would need to fear shells equipped with fuses that could not distinguish the pursuit curve of a friendly fighter closing in on an enemy aircraft from the dive path of that enemy aircraft itself attempting to crash into a ship. The technology itself was neutral, incapable of making such distinctions. It fell to doctrine, to the procedures and standards that were developed through hard experience, to teach the fleet how to make that distinction on behalf of the technology. In the final accounting of the battle for Okinawa, which lasted from April through June of 1945 and cost thousands of American and Japanese lives both ashore and at sea, the proximity fuse occupies a position that is both celebrated and sobering. It is celebrated as a technological achievement that saved lives by making the fleet's anti-aircraft defences significantly more effective than they would otherwise have been. Ships that might have been sunk by kamikaze attacks survived because proximity-fused shells destroyed or crippled the attackers before they could complete their dives. Sailors who would have died if their ships had been hit remained alive because the defensive firepower kept aircraft at bay. At the same time, the proximity fuse serves as a stern teacher about the unintended consequences and complications that can accompany even beneficial technological innovations. It made the sky deadlier for the attackers, unquestionably, but it also made that same sky more perilous, at least for a time, for the defenders who flew through it in pursuit of those attackers. The friendly fire incidents, the near misses, the damaged aircraft and wounded pilots, all of these represented costs that had to be paid while the organization learned how to employ the new weapon effectively without inflicting casualties on its own forces. The fact that these costs were eventually reduced through better procedures and stricter coordination does not erase the experiences of the men who paid them during the learning period. The veterans of that campaign, both the pilots who flew and the sailors who manned the guns, would carry forward an understanding that technological advantage alone is not sufficient for victory. Technology must be integrated into doctrine, procedures must be developed and refined, and the humans who employ the technology must be trained not just in its mechanical operation, but in the broader context of how it fits into the overall defensive or offensive system. The proximity fuse was a remarkable device, a genuine breakthrough in capability, but its full potential could only be realized when it was employed by well-trained crews operating under sound doctrine that accounted for both the capabilities and the limitations of the technology. In the decades that followed the Second World War, as the United States Navy continued to develop and refine its approach to fleet air defense, the experiences of Okinawa remained relevant. The introduction of surface-to-air missiles, beginning with weapons like the Talos and Terrier systems in the 1950s and continuing through successive generations of increasingly capable missiles, created new versions of the same fundamental challenge that the proximity fuse had highlighted. How do you create an effective defensive envelope around the fleet that can destroy or turn back attackers without creating unacceptable hazards for friendly aircraft operating in the same airspace? The answers developed over the years, involving increasingly sophisticated identification, friend or foe systems, better communications, more precise control over engagement zones, and eventually computer-driven systems that could track hundreds of targets simultaneously and manage the allocation of weapons against threats. But underneath all of these technological developments, the human factors remained constant. Pilots still needed to trust that the ships they were protecting would not shoot them down. Gunners and, later, missile system operators still needed to have confidence that they could engage threats aggressively without committing fratricide. Fighter directors and air warfare commanders still needed to make rapid decisions about where to position assets and when to authorize weapons release. Decisions that could mean the difference between a raid turned back and a ship sent to the bottom. The story of the proximity fuse at Okinawa, then, is not just a story about a technological innovation or about a particular battle. It is a story about the friction that exists between different elements of a complex defensive system, about the process of learning and adaptation under the pressure of combat, and about the courage of men who continued to fly and fight even when they knew that some of the explosions they encountered in the sky above the fleet might be from shells fired to protect them. The hunters who ranged out ahead of the fleet to meet the kamikaze attacks did so, knowing that the sky they operated in had become a more dangerous place for everyone, friend and foe alike. The fact that they continued to do so, mission after mission, speaks to a kind of determination and professionalism that transcends technology and doctrine.